Hi, welcome to the BYU-Idaho Tutoring Center videos. The topic of today's video is key events in life history. So as we go through today, make sure you pay important attention to the dates and the events, because you may be asked to, on test, to know the dates associated with certain events. So to start off, the fossil record is used. Scientists have used it to create a geological record, or otherwise known as the geological timescale. And it's just a classification of different time periods throughout the history of life. And so we have different classifications. It's made up of eons, eras, and periods. There's 3 eons. Eons are then divided into eras, and then eras are even further divided into periods. And you won't be required to memorize the entire geological timescale and all the numbers associated with it unless you take some sort of geological course. However, be familiar with this eon. It's called the Paleozoic eon. It's the 3rd eon, and it has 3 eras: the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. And those are the ones that we focus on because that's where a lot of life starts to happen. So to start off, this is kind of a scale of major events in the history of life on Earth. Note that it's not to scale. All these different events are divided according to how long it actually took. So the first is about 4.6 billion years ago. That's what BYA stands for, billion years ago. We believe that Earth originated. And then the conditions on Earth did not allow life to arise for kind of a long time until about 3.5 billion years ago. That's where we have the first earliest fossil evidence of life. And so because of that, scientists assume that life could have been as early as 3.9 billion years ago. We just don't have any evidence of that left. And so the evidence for the 3.5 billion years ago actually comes from stromatolites. And these are just layered rocks that are formed when prokaryotics bind sediment together. And we actually see these today, and they're also in the fossil record. And so prokaryotes were kind of the only life form for a very long time, but they had a very important impact on our Earth and its environment. And so one of the things that they impacted was the amount of oxygen in our atmosphere. So if you remember, early Earth didn't have a lot of oxygen in its atmosphere. It was mostly nitrogen and carbon dioxide and other things such as methane. That's what it was believed. And so what happened is, we know that oxygen comes from biological processes. The oxygen in our atmosphere comes from photosynthesis, when photosynthetic organisms split water and then use the protons or the electrons in the light reactions, and that whole process that you learned in Bio-180. So we had some photosynthetic prokaryotics, mostly cyanobacteria, that were living in the oceans at that time. And they were producing this oxygen, and this oxygen at first was combining with iron and forming iron oxides that then precipitated into form these sediments and rocks, and we actually see that in the fossil record. That's the red rock that we see a lot of times. But eventually there was so much oxygen that was being produced that the ocean was so saturated with it that a lot of it actually gassed up or rose into the atmosphere and became part of the atmosphere. And so we started to really increase the amount of oxygen we had in our atmosphere. And it actually got to a point where it was 10% higher, more oxygen than we actually have in our atmosphere currently today. And this is called the oxygen revolution. And it had a really big impact on the living things, because there's a lot of organisms that were anaerobic, or they could not survive in the presence of oxygen. And so a lot of them died off. We still have some anaerobic organisms today that were able to find locations in which they weren't exposed to oxygen. But some of the other organisms actually adapted the ability to do silent respiration, which they're able to use the oxygen and survive in the presence of oxygen. And so that kind of brings us to our next theme. We have our first eukaryotics show up in the fossil record about 2.1 billion years ago. And so the kind of current theory on how eukaryotics arose is endosymbiosis. And so you're going to really need to understand this and evidence for it. So endosymbiosis, endo refers to inside, and symbiosis refers to the process in which 2 different organisms are in contact with each other, and they're both benefiting from this contact. So what happens is, they believe that you have some prokaryotic cell, and over time, part of its cell membrane kind of sunk in or moved in, And this eventually led to the formation of a nucleus and ER because this membrane now became part of the endomembrane system. And then what they believe happened is that mitochondria, some ancient ancestry of the mitochondria was a prokaryote. So if you remember, the main difference between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells is that eukaryotic cells are a lot more complex. They have a nucleus, membrane-bound organelles, and they also have plastids, which are also called, one way we say chloroplasts, and they have mitochondria. And so this is kind of how the mitochondria and plastids became part of them. And so they actually believe that mitochondria and plastids were originally prokaryotic cells that were living out on their own, and they were engulfed by a different prokaryotic cell. And when they were engulfed, it kind of formed this endosymbiosis relationship, because the bigger cell gained some of the products or the metabolic products from the smaller prokaryotic, the ancient ancestor of mitochondria, and the ancient ancestor of mitochondria gained protection from the oxygen environment if it was anaerobic, and protection from outside prokaryotic cells. And so then eventually this relationship stayed and was passed on to the point that it just became part of the cell. And that's why we see mitochondria in our human cells. And so that formed some heterotrophic eukaryotic cells. And then some of these heterotrophic cells then kind of did a similar thing with plastids. There was some sort of ancient prokaryotic cell that had photosynthetic abilities. It was engulfed by a larger cell and eventually became a part of it to form some photosynthetic eukaryotic. And so this idea that because all eukaryotic cells have mitochondria, but not all of them have some sort of plastids, it's believed that the mitochondria was engulfed first, which is called the serial endosymbiosis, just that mitochondria were absorbed first. And so some evidence that mitochondria and plastids are actually descendant of prokaryotic cells lies in that they have their own membranes, they have their own membrane proteins, they divide themselves in a manner that's very similar to how prokaryotic cells divide. They have their own DNA, circular stranded DNA, which is very similar to many prokaryotes. And they have many other different properties that you will be able to look at in your book of why they are so similar to prokaryotes that they're believed that they originate from prokaryotes. So from this point, after we have seen our first eukaryotes, now we develop multicellular organisms. And so we get multiple eukaryotes coming together to form a multicellular organism. And so the first that we really start to see this is 1.2 billion years ago, but these are more smaller organisms. We don't see our larger multicellular organisms until about 565 million years ago. That's what MYA stands for. And this kind of leads into the Cambrian explosion. We're starting to form some multicellular organisms, and around this time, 535 to 525, we get a really big increase of multicellular organisms. Prior to this, our multicellular organisms were mostly soft-bodied, they're mostly herbivores, plant-eating, but with the Cambrian explosion, we see more predators and prey relationships, and so adaptations to defend yourself against your predator and for the predator to easier get their prey. And so just know that the Cambrian explosion is a big increase of lots of eukaryotic organisms. And so the final thing is about 500 million years ago, we start with the colonization of land, both plants and animals. Plants developed different things that they wouldn't dehydrate, being outside of the water, and then different organisms, there's lots of different ideas and hypotheses and theories about different organisms coming out of the water, either to escape from predators, and they develop different adaptations so that they can survive out of the water. And so this is kind of, from here we continue on our path of natural selection and evolution until we eventually get to our world, how we see it today. I hope this video was helpful. I hope you have a better understanding of the key events and the timeline scale of life's early history, and especially endosymbiosis. Make sure you know all of these numbers on this timeline scale. Thank you for watching and have a great day.